As we reach the end of 1996, we reach another Mega Man game, and this time the Blue Bomber has finally entered the 32-bit generation. Mega Man 8 would be released just before the end of the year, marking the franchise's 10th anniversary. But back in April, Japan and Europe received an enhanced port of Mega Man X3 for both the PlayStation and Saturn. With X3 being released so late into the SNES's lifespan, and using a new custom chip that made the cartridges limited and more expensive, Capcom decided to port the game to the newer CD-based consoles to try to get a bit more mileage out of it. The gameplay remains the same, with most of the enhancements being applied to the game's overall presentation. Sound effects and music were updated for the new hardware, and animated FMV cutscenes were added at key story points, as well as to introduce each of the Mavericks. In the grand scheme of things, you're getting more or less the same experience either way, but this port definitely has its issues. The game is still rife with typos, even in the new FMVs, as seen with Bilzerd Buffalo, and the so-called updated music and sound effects sound kind of muted. In the move from SNES to PS1 synths, it feels like something got lost in translation. It's all way too subdued, less grunge and more elevator music, and it's hard to say whether this was an intentional creative decision or just a byproduct of the new hardware. There are a few clearly purposeful choices, namely they sped up Neon Tiger's music, presumably to make its Guns N' Roses inspiration less blatant. Then again, for those who haven't played the Super Nintendo version, maybe the new arrangements won't sound that bad, but in my opinion, the new tracks just don't really hit the way they should. Nonetheless, the disc version of X3 would seemingly become Capcom's favored version for quite a while after this, as it's the version of X3 that was included in the Mega Man X collection in 2006, which was also the first time the PS1 port was released in America at all. In more recent years, though, Capcom seems to have shifted their opinion, as the Mega Man X Legacy Collection from 2018 would include the standard SNES version instead. With how expensive the SNES carts can get nowadays, I've seen just the cartridge alone go for around $300, and with how much of a hassle it can be to run imported PS1 games since PS1s aren't region-free, it is nice to have more reasonable and affordable ways to access both versions. After the rush job that was Mega Man 7, and with the franchise's 10th anniversary on the horizon, Keiji Inafune and his team wanted to take the time to get the next one just right. Mega Man 7 had been created in just 3 months, with the concurrently developed Mega Man X3 outsourced to a different studio entirely. With Mega Man 8, the franchise was moving ahead to the next generation, and along with the extra workload this new tech would bring, among such being full motion video and voice acting, this newest Mega Man was also the first to be developed for 2 different systems simultaneously, with versions for both PlayStation and Saturn released just a month apart. Borrowing from the Mega Man X games, just like Mega Man 7 did, we start with an intro stage that acclimates us to the game, and even in these opening moments, the game already had me worried. Mega Man seems to move at a snail's pace here. Now, I wasn't expecting the classic Mega Man series to adopt the frenetic whipping and zipping movement of the X titles, and these games have never felt super responsive to me to begin with, but even just compared to Mega Man 7, movement in this game feels so sluggish. Mega Man's run cycle is very smooth and with a high number of animation frames, to the point where it seems over-animated, and along with his weird floaty jump, it all gives the impression that Mega Man is made out of rubber. The level assets also suffer from odd graphical design, as many of the platforms in this game are actually deceptively much longer than their sprites suggest, often requiring the player to damn near run off of the platform in order for their jumps to attain the required distance. Mega Man 8 also introduces the ability to swim, and in contrast to his land-based movement, his underwater traversal is absurdly quick by comparison. In terms of just sheer look, though, Mega Man 8 is a really nice-looking game, with varied, lively, colorful backgrounds and scenery, and large, detailed enemy sprites. I don't have any real complaints about the graphics themselves, I just wish the game moved a smidge quicker. As it stands, it feels like the game is constantly stuck at like 75% speed or something. On PlayStation, controls stick largely to Mega Man 7's setup, with 2 jump buttons and 2 shoot buttons, with the shoulder buttons cycling through your different obtained special weapons, and the start button opening your menu. The most notable change, however, is that now you can always use your standard buster shots even when a special weapon is equipped. The square button will fire the currently equipped weapon, while the triangle button will always fire the buster. This comes in incredibly handy, as you might expect, allowing you to, for example, keep a special weapon on standby while you handle general tasks and cannon fodder with your standard shots. It's so useful that it's actually a little frustrating that no future games, neither Classic nor X, would continue this. I mean, Legends did, but that game is basically an entirely new genre, and we haven't gotten a new entry in like 25 years. I'm sure Legends 3 will be coming out any day now, though. New to Mega Man 8 is that the intro stage grants you a bonus special weapon before you've even defeated a single boss. In what might be a reference to Mega Man Soccer, which I will not be talking about, please don't ask me to, Mega Man is granted this little soccer ball thingy to kick around. The Mega Ball is not a bad weapon. It ricochets off walls, floors, and ceilings, and plows right through most minor enemies and debris, making it perfect for breaking through enemies that like to spam projectiles or shields. But the weapon does have a bit of a learning curve. You can adjust its angle of fire by holding up when kicking it, and once you get the hang of how to properly angle it for ricochets, it can be devastating for certain enemies. One boss in particular is even weak to it, and that boss takes place in an arena where the Mega Ball is almost definitively the most sensible weapon to use. It also sort of acts as Mega Man 8's replacement for the Rush Coil, which doesn't appear here at all, by granting you a boosted jump if you hold the button while jumping on it. And this can even be used in mid-air with proper timing. I could never get it right, though. Just like in Mega Man 7, the traditional roster of 8 bosses has again been split into 2 fixed groups of 4, with an extra stage in the middle to serve mainly as a means to progress the plot some more. It seems like this was a decision made from very early on, as the second batch of levels can't be cleared without the special weapons from the first batch. The level select screen also displays a globe that denotes each Robot Master's location, which is a detail that adds a little more sense of scale to the whole thing, while also explaining why the levels tend to be so environmentally diverse. The Robot Master stages are in line with what we've come to expect by now. Themed obstacle courses full of enemies and hazards, most of which feature some sort of puzzle, gimmick, or set piece that is repeated exactly twice per stage. Of the first 4 bosses to choose from, Tengu Man is probably the easiest boss to defeat. He takes the most damage from the standard buster, and he doesn't give you many chances to hit him with his weakness anyway, but I personally went with Clown Man first. His stage is pretty simple, and his attacks are easy enough to avoid. For special weapons, we have a pretty useful selection. Tornado Hold acts as both a makeshift barrier weapon and a makeshift rush coil, destroying any weak enemies that wander into it, as well as being a means for Mega Man to reach greater heights. Thunderclaw attacks fast with decent range, and Mega Man can use it to grab and swing from hooks. It's like the Strike Chain from X2, except it actually grabs things. Until it doesn't. Flash Bomb might be the strongest weapon in the game in terms of pure damage output. It explodes on contact and causes continuous damage in its wake, and can be fired up to 2 at a time. Not to mention it's also used to light up dark areas, and is useful against several Robot Masters, including the sadomasochistic Grenade Man, which makes a disturbing amount of sense considering it's his own weapon. Ice Wave is a ground-crawling weapon, which is useful for the handful of rush jet sections, or any instance where enemies are directly below you. Flame Sword is a devastating close-range weapon that you'll be using against the game's final boss, as well as to light wicks or burn bushes. It also somehow works underwater, and while it's true that elements like magnesium do burn underwater, the Flame Sword isn't white and thus is probably not magnesium-based. Yes, it was once again my co-writer who insisted on bringing that up, and my YouTube channel is probably the most actual use he's gotten out of his chemistry degree since graduating. Aquaman's weapon is the water balloon, which definitely seems like the booby prize weapon here. It can be fired rapidly, unlike most other Robot Master weapons, and it does absolutely cripple Swordman, but other than that, it's pretty pathetic. The homing sniper is probably the most versatile homing weapon so far, being able to lock onto multiple targets at once for fire and forget capabilities, but against bosses, I found its damage output left a lot to be desired. Using it against Astro Man will keep him from using his Astro Crush, but in terms of actually hurting him, I just use the standard charge shot since it does around the same amount of damage anyway. And speaking of Astro Crush, that one's a screen nuke, clearing out basic enemies and revealing certain hidden pathways, all while granting Mega Man invincibility for the duration. Aside from the Robot Master who's weak to it though, it doesn't deal any damage to them whatsoever. Honestly though, the really useful thing about Astro Crush is that it locks Mega Man in place, which helps in cheesing the game's dumb snowboarding sections if you time it right. And oh god, those snowboarding sections. Look, there are a few levels in this game I wasn't a huge fan of. Like, Astroman's level starts with an annoying switch maze, and then the second half is just a second, even longer switch maze. But then his boss arena did this cool little space hologram thing with the background, so I was like, that's pretty neat, I forgive you, I guess. Frostman's stage, though? Okay. Even by 1996, Inafune and his team apparently hadn't gotten the memo that most people really don't like auto-scroll segments in side-scrollers, and this game has several. The Rush Jet segments are fine, simple little bullet shooters that are overall pretty low stakes since the only way to die is to take too much damage, and the game provides ample power-ups and assists to aid you. I actually really like these segments. They were a fun way to include all the other robot helper characters like Eddie and Otto, and they felt like a cool set piece each time they showed up. But the game also includes 3 snowboarding sections, wherein you have to dodge or defeat enemies while successfully pulling off patterns of jumps and slides to avoid instant death. And these ended up being the parts of the game that took me the most retries by far. Mega Man 8's sprites are much larger and more detailed than the other classic games, and since this resulted in the amount of viewable screen space being proportionally much smaller, the game prepares you for each incoming gap or low ceiling with these very on-the-nose audio cues. On the one hand, this did feel necessary given the cramped screen space, and these segments would have been infinitely worse without these warnings. On the other hand, I'll be hearing this shit in my nightmares. By the time I finished each snowboarding segment, I'd heard these stupid robot things yelling at me so much that I wanted to rip my hair out. Where most levels in the game feature some sort of mid-stage mini-boss to act as a transition between the first and second halves, nearly the entire first half of Frostman's stage is just one of these snowboarding sections, as if the game designers knew that any mini-boss they came up with wouldn't be nearly as difficult as the damn auto-scrolling. I think the most interesting changes Mega Man 8 made were the ones made to Mega Man's arsenal and the returning shop system for Mega Man 7. This time, both the number of upgrades you can buy and the number of bolts you can pick up are finite. There are only 40 bolts in the game, and your upgrade slots max out at 8. Most of the upgrades are some new form of weapon, or enhancements to Mega Man's current abilities or moveset. Most useful by far is the Arrow Shot, which turns the Charge Shot into an incredibly useful spread, capable of clearing groups of enemies or even breaking through certain defenses, such as Sniper Joe's shield. There's also the Laser Shot, which changes the Charge Shot into a powerful laser beam. It's even possible to get both of these, since one does not override the other. Just select which one you want to use from the pause menu and you're good to go. The Power Shield permanently eliminates knockback whenever Mega Man takes a hit, which is great for those pesky enemies that like to camp on thin platforms in the hopes of knocking you off. There are upgrades that allow Mega Man to fire more shots at once, or automatically fire 3 at a time, or that speed up the Buster Shot, either the amount of time it takes to charge or the speed of the shot itself. You can get upgrades that reduce ammo depletion for special weapons, or that increase the amount of health or ammo restored from pickups, or that will reallocate energy pickups into ammo if your health is already at max. You can even increase Mega Man's slide speed, or how fast he climbs ladders. All that being said, a few of the upgrades feel pretty pointless. The energy balancer and exit upgrades have their uses. The former automatically distributes ammo refills to the weapon most in need of it, and the latter allows you to exit stages at any time as long as you've cleared them at least once. But both of those feel like features that really should just be standard in the first place. And there are 2 upgrades that only affect your lives count, one that refills your lives to the minimum at the end of each stage, and one that grants you extra lives after each game over. But those both feel unnecessary in a game with unlimited continues and a save feature. Oh yeah, that's right, you can actually save your game now. And I mean like onto an actual save file, instead of having to write down a password. That's right, after a full decade, a spin-off series, and 2 whole console generations, Mega Man games finally adopted the revolutionary and groundbreaking quality of life feature that is saving. Half of the upgrades aren't made available until you clear out the first 4 Robot Masters, and so with all that in mind, you need to go in with some kind of plan as to what sort of kit you want to outfit Mega Man with. Since the more useful upgrades tend to cost more bolts, you realistically won't even fill up all 8 available slots. While at first the idea of finite bolts and upgrades had me worried, in practice I actually ended up really liking this. It added an unexpected element of customization to the typical formula, and it essentially means that every player will have their own custom build for Mega Man. This is something you see a lot of RPGs and open-world games doing in the modern day. It really helps in making this game stand out when compared to the other classic Mega Man titles. You can even revisit the intro and mid-game stages to find any bolts you missed there, so there's no fear of leaving bolts behind by accident. My only real complaint is that I would have appreciated some indicator to help me track down the bolts I've missed, similar to the helmet upgrade from X3. That really isn't the type of thing I should need to look up a walkthrough for. All these additions to Mega Man's roster means that E-Tanks have been retired for now. Whenever you lose a life or pass a mid-level checkpoint, all your energy and weapon ammo is refilled, meaning there's no bullshit boo beam trap shenanigans to worry about here, and you can use special weapons against bosses to your heart's content. The transition into the second half of each stage is a bit awkward though. Instead of having Mega Man run in or something a little more consistent or cohesive, it just does the same old teleport animation as the beginning of the stage, which feels lazy. In any case, it seems like the various new Rush adapters have replaced the standard E-Tanks. Upon defeating certain mini-bosses, they'll drop one of 4 Rush adapters that can henceforth be activated from the pause menu and used either once per stage or once per life. The super armor from Mega Man 6 and 7 is nowhere to be seen here, and with the Rush coil gone and the Rush jet limited to certain scripted set pieces, these adapters instead act as support abilities. Rush Question, or Rush Item as it's also known, acts as a combination of Rush Search and Eddy, where Rush will come in and attempt to dig up a useful item, such as health and ammo refills or a 1-up. Sometimes though, Rush may instead decide to just do nothing and take a nap instead. Rush Bomber and Rush Health both see Rush flying around and dropping either bombs or helpful items respectively, and let me tell you, that came in clutch during a couple boss fights for me. Rush Cycle turns Rush into a motorbike, akin to the ride chasers from the X games. Mega Man is technically invulnerable while riding, although Rush will retreat when too many hits are taken. Honestly, this one wasn't very useful. The Rush Cycle has no means of moving up, and so it's really only useful for long horizontal stretches, of which this game has very few. I just used it to get this one bolt in Clown Man's stage. Every other time I tried to use it, it ended up not being much help. While the Mega Ball and Tornado Hold do enough to make up for the loss of Rush Coil, I can't help feeling like Rush Cycle really should have just been Rush Jet, or the Super Armor, instead. And the absence of the Super Armor feels especially egregious, since the fight with Bass still sees him and Treble forming their own Super Armor. So, what gives, Dr. Light?
That's a good question.
The most obvious evolutions in Mega Man 8 were to the game's presentation. In addition to the fancy new 32-bit sprite work, the game wastes no time showing off the 2 major features the new generation of hardware brought: animated cutscenes and voice acting. The pre-title screen FMV is fine enough, a reenactment of classic Robot Master battles from all the prior games, and a showcase of all the important characters we'll be seeing. In Japan, this was accompanied by a vocal theme song, but this was replaced with an instrumental score in international versions. I'm assuming because publishers didn't want to deal with the music licensing costs. When you start a new game, the story begins, and after the treasure trove that was Resident Evil, we're again gifted with the glorious, glorious voice acting of mid-90s Capcom.
Dr. Light, what is the problem?
A strange meteor has fallen to Earth just a while ago. When we find that meteor, we'll find Dr. Wily.
The barrier prohibits me from going there. I'll destroy the rest of the evil energy that has spread throughout the Earth.
What happened, Mega Man?
Am I alive?
Yes, you are.
All of the problems with Resident Evil's voice acting are repeated here, and somehow made even worse. Resident Evil at least had the excuse of being a bit of an homage to cheesy Hollywood B-films. But Mega Man 8, despite obviously skewing to a much younger crowd, for the most part takes itself very seriously. And yet, the voice acting is just as flat, unprofessional, and downright baffling as Resident Evil's was. Just like that game, we've got unqualified guy-off-the-street actors using voices that don't really fit their character.
Don't run away, coward. You'll pay for this insult.
We've got actors stumbling over words.
You must recover all the energy immediately, Mega Man.
We've got characters mispronouncing other characters' names.
Hey, Zach! Why must I fight you? We are not enemies!
It's honestly incredible. To be clear, this isn't entirely the fault of the actors. This is the result of mid-90s Capcom as a whole, which at the time barely even had a proper localization team. Just like with Resident Evil, the translated scripts and voice recordings were done almost entirely in Japan by Japanese staff who didn't have a firm grasp on English. Lines would be recorded with almost no context and in only a few takes, and then the Japanese director and sound editors would just pick the takes that they thought sounded the best. likely based mostly on cadence and rhythm rather than the quality of delivery. This is why nearly every line seems so disjointed, and why so many of the characters sound kinda dopey. Why does Dr. Light sound like Elmer Fudd?
Something this powerful must not fall into the hands of evil.
Well, because the Japanese staff thought the voice was cool and didn't realize how dumb that accent sounded. Why does Mega Man pronounce bass like the fish instead of the musical clef? Well, because the Japanese staff don't know the difference, they just assumed it was correct. After all, the character's name in Japan is Forte. Why does Duo sound like just some guy instead of a badass galactic hero?
This is what you people call evil energy. Based on my studies so far, the one who obtained the original energy must be a being of complete evil.
Well, because nobody on the casting team really knew what badass galactic heroes sound like in English. This is all a perfect demonstration of why proper localization is so important, especially with regards to games that use full-blown voice acting instead of just text boxes. In-game, the Robot Masters are also given voices, and while they're not exactly great either, they at least benefit from being just short sound bites instead of full voice lines. They also serve to add a bit of personality to the game's bosses, such as Grenade Man being a sadomasochist, Astro Man being something of a coward, and Aquaman being a bit on the flamboyant side. For prior Mega Man games, this was stuff you would have to scour a bunch of supplementary material in online databases to learn about, but now we have a way of gleaning certain aspects of these guys' personalities without having to do a bunch of homework. Aside from the voice acting though, the FMV cutscenes also show off that Mega Man 8 is really upping the scale with its storytelling, with a relatively ambitious narrative compared to prior entries. It's written and structured like a classic shonen anime, something that really comes through when paired with the Japanese vocal theme that accompanies its intro. The story this time largely revolves around a new character, Duo. Well, I guess he wasn't completely new. He first appeared in the arcade game Mega Man 2 The Power Fighters, which actually takes place after this game despite being released a few months earlier. But to get back on track, after a battle in space against a mysterious enemy, Duo crashes to Earth and is found and recovered by Mega Man and Dr. Light, who in the process also uncover a new evil energy source Dr. Wily has been seeking. Evil energy. Like that's what it's called. That's the proper noun, with capital letters and everything. This evil energy, it's called evil energy. Duo eventually recovers from unconsciousness, and while initially distrustful of Mega Man, he soon senses the good in him and ultimately ends up as Mega Man's newest ally. Oh, and Bass is here too, although he really isn't much of a presence in this story. He shows up in the opening cutscene and then completely disappears until the Wily levels, where you fight him in what's basically just a repeat of his fight from the last game. Roll and Proto Man also show up for like one scene each. It's like Capcom felt obligated to include as many characters as possible, even if they didn't really have anything for them to do. I get that it's an anniversary game and all, but bloat is bloat, guys. And I will say, it's still really disappointing to have the final boss just be Dr. Wily again. The opening cutscene even tricks you into thinking there's some new mysterious enemy to fight this time, but no, it's just Wily again. By the way, has he always dressed like Dracula? Like, what's with the cape? The final cutscene also threw me off, if only for continuity reasons. See, the final boss takes place inside Wily's fortress and ends with Wily trapping Mega Man with this wireframe thingy, and then it just cuts to an FMV where Mega Man is lying and unconscious in the middle of a wasteland. I think the implication is that Wily escaped his crumbling fortress and left Mega Man for dead in the rubble, but we're not shown any of that, resulting in the final scene feeling incongruent with the actual gameplay. I get the feeling there maybe wasn't a whole lot of communication between the game devs and the animators in this instance. Still, I can't bash the story too much. It's clear that the team was trying. It's got a lot of heart, and for kids, it's perfectly fine. If there's one aspect of the game that does feel a bit phoned in, it's the music. Or at least I just wasn't very fond of it. Everything feels real generic, and some stages like Swordman and Clownman loop way too fast for my liking. True, we've had shorter tracks in the classic series before, but those were on earlier hardware, and were also high-energy tunes to compensate. There's nothing bombastic about these tracks, and that's fine for the occasional breather, but when the whole game is low-key like this, it feels kinda boring. I'm sure some of you like these themes, and that's fine, music is subjective, but the lack of energy in the tracks makes everything feel kinda low stakes in my opinion. Like, there's all this evil energy and these robots are wreaking havoc, and here Mega Man is just plodding along, getting around to them eventually. The Saturn version of Mega Man 8 sees exclusive content not included in the PlayStation release. Enemy variety is expanded, water graphics are more advanced, and the music features different instrumentation, with Tengu Man's stage in particular receiving a new track entirely. Most notable of all, though, is that there are additional, optional boss fights with two classic robot masters, Cutman and Woodman. Given all this, the Saturn version definitely feels like the definitive version of Mega Man 8, which in the modern day can be frustrating, seeing how difficult it can be to port or emulate Saturn games. Every Mega Man compilation released since has defaulted to the PlayStation version of Mega Man 8 for seemingly that exact reason. PS1 games are just easier to deal with. Between the two, the Saturn version is also the one that feels like it lives up to being the anniversary Mega Man title, so it's a bit of a shame to see it continuously stuck on a dead console. Despite all the things about Mega Man 8 that are maybe not great, the bad voice acting and overall plotting movement of its main character being probably the most egregious, this is probably the most fun I've had with a classic Mega Man game since Mega Man 3. For a game that's advertised as an anniversary title, removing iconic elements like the Rush Coil and E-Tanks may seem a strange decision for longtime fans, and locking the two legacy bosses behind a specific console is also a shame in that regard, since those bosses help contribute to the game feeling like something of a celebration. Oh, what, you mean the Green Devil fight isn't enough for you guys? But removed from that context and taken on its own merits, I really appreciate the lengths this game went to finally stand out among the classic titles. The graphical leap and more fleshed out story presentation definitely helps, but even outside of that, the customizable skill system and new roster of equipment and power-ups finally make the franchise feel somewhat fresh again, outside of a full-on reboot like Mega Man X. I can understand opinions on this game being very mixed among the fandom. For every person calling Mega Man 8 one of their favorites, I've seen just as many people calling it absolute garbage. Even my co-writer and I disagree on this. He sees it as overall disappointing, while I liked it quite a lot. In any case, this would be the last classic Mega Man title for a long time. Capcom would from here on choose to focus on the Mega Man X games, as well as a handful of new spin-off series they would introduce in the coming years. We wouldn't see a continuation of the classic series for another 12 years, and when we did, it was a nostalgia-focused sequel meant to celebrate the game's 8-bit entries. So for now at least, this channel says farewell to classic Mega Man. But I assure you that, for a while at least, we'll be seeing a bit more of the Blue Bomber to come. I didn't grow up with Mega Man, and so I don't have the nostalgic fondness for the franchise that a lot of you may have. But when I beat Dr. Wily yet again and saw the credits roll, accompanied by a bunch of fan art that the team used when creating the Robot Masters over the years, I couldn't help but smile. If I was a kid who liked Mega Man, this would be the coolest thing to see. And this reminded me that Mega Man is very much a franchise made for the fans. And as frustrating, as repetitive, and as paint-by-numbers as I find these games sometimes, seeing how much the developers truly love and appreciate their young fans somehow makes it all worth it in the end.